CFO, highest paid person speaking. But more and more are being brought under the wing of rational analysis. So in crime fighting, for example, we have data-driven policing, where data are gathered on where the hotspots for crime and the resources concentrated there, probably one of the reasons for the great American crime decline in the 1990s. We have evidence-based medicine, which should be a redundancy. We have Moneyball in sports. We've got poll aggregation, polling like 538.com, feedback informed therapy. So rational approaches are being applied to more domains, and of course the recent advances in artificial intelligence. But at the same time, it's never been easier to propagate nonsense, and there are movements, some autocratic and authoritarian populist movements, deliberately try to, I'm quoting Steve Bannon, flood the zone with shit. That is, spread so many propositions without any claim to being true that people no longer know what to believe and therefore are more receptive to what an autocrat would dictate. And of course we see that in Russia and other autocracies as well. So it's sort of hard to, given that these extremes, it's hard to know how to give a report card to the world as a whole.
What about just American society? Like, you gave a number of examples, including you showed some pictures of January 6th and so forth, let's just say politically laden examples, which fed into your talk. But it does seem like there's more of that, or more extreme examples about this or that, from either side, perhaps, though I don't actually think it's really balanced. I think there's more from one political side. But either way,
yeah, I think you can quantify it. There is more from the right than from the left, although it does come from both sides. And the polarization itself, which we've all read about, particularly negative polarization, given that one of the main sources of irrationality is not ignorance, but rather adoption of dogmas that are signature issues for your side, that as people become more polarized, you expect that more opinions will be held on irrational grounds. Namely, that's what my side believes, and I'm sticking with it. And I do consider that the main threat, and it is, I agree, there is more fake news from the right than from the left. But the left has not been holding up its end of the rationality bargain when you have so many cancellations and censorship and partisan political branding of scientific and cultural institutions. So there's contributions from the left as well.
And do you see that polarization? I mean, I agree with all of that. Do you think that that's causally linked in the way that you discuss? In other words, is polarization driving the adoption of these ideas in that tribal mode that you just described? Or is there some kind of more complex causality in which they feed back on each other?
Yeah, I think there is. I think the answer is it more complex than what you just said?
Yes.
That question is always yes. It's always more complex. But I think the polarization, and we don't really completely understand the reasons for the polarization, but I think polarization is driving a lot of it. I mean, the conventional answer for why we're polarized is social media, which may be part of the answer, but I don't think it's the entire answer.
What role do you think it plays?
I think it makes it, it's interesting, as someone who has, despite having a reputation for optimism, mainly because I plot data that presents a more positive picture than what you get from the news, because the news is a non-random sample of the worst things happening on Earth at any given time. So if you only base your understanding of the world from headlines, you're being fed with increasing efficiency a non-random sample of every disaster and calamity. And positive developments are often things that don't happen. That is, a part of the world that is at peace.
Not a story.
40 years of peace in Vietnam. When I was a student, this would have been unthinkably utopian. But it's true, but it's not a headline. Or things that build up by a few percentage points a year and compound, and so no one ever notices them, but they can transform the world, such as the decline in extreme poverty, which has, as Max Roser put it, the papers could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never had that headline, and the result is 1 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. So in just discussing facts like that, I'm sometimes called an optimist. Although I have a rather dark view of human nature. That was the topic of my book, The Blank Slate. I believe there is such a thing as human nature. And one of the things that social media has kind of unveiled is if you just let people say their thing, contrary to expectations that I made even in moving to Harvard, that you get a kind of new enlightenment as people share ideas. But unless you actually build in safeguards like peer review, editing, fact-checking, people don't really have much of a commitment to objectivity and truth in their own intuitions. It's not the reason people believe most things outside their immediate experience. And I didn't get to talk about that this afternoon. It's a major theme of my book, Rationality, that outside immediate everyday experience, where people I think are quite rational, and you kind of have to have an appreciation of causality and objectivity and truth. Otherwise, you won't keep food in the fridge, and gas in the car, and the kids kind of clothed and fed and off to school on time, because reality is merciless. It won't put up with your fallacies and biases, and so whether through evolution or learning, we're not bad at navigating our physical environment. But a lot of the opinions that we think of as irrational just don't affect people day to day. What was the cause of a particular war? What's the cause of fortune and misfortune? Where did human species arise from? How old is the universe? It kind of doesn't matter to most people to your day-to-day life. And until very recently, until the scientific revolution and data revolution and revolution in data keeping and journalism, no one could know. Any belief was as good as any other belief. There's no way of dating the universe until quite recently. And our minds are adapted to a world without science, in which there is no way to find objective answers to these big cosmic and historical questions. And so people believe things because they are morally uplifting, because they're entertaining, they're a good story, they're good things for kids to believe, they're edifying. Whether they're true or false, I think people don't have the intuition that that's even possible or desirable. And so unfettered expression will naturally lead to a lot of nonsense being circulated. And I think we probably should have been able to predict that, but just letting everyone have an opinion by itself is not going to push toward objective truth. And we need something like the guidelines of Wikipedia. So I think that helps polarization, because you could have different people with their mutually incompatible.
Helps meaning promotes it.
That's right. I mean, helps maybe doesn't make it better, but
right.
makes it increase. That's right. Although I think it's not the only reason. There are other sociological phenomena, such as the residential segregation by level of education and decline. That is, people with college degrees live with people near people with college degrees and see them and talk to them, and people without, conversely, live with their own kind. And both mixed neighborhoods and institutions like religious organizations, service clubs, bowling leagues, compulsory armed service, which used to mix people from different educational backgrounds, have weakened. And so you get echo chambers that can be self-reinforcing. So I think that's another reason for polarization.
I want to come back to social media, but just on the point you made about people not knowing things that we didn't need to know, I'm kind of a lapsed political scientist, but in political science we talk about rational ignorance in a lot of settings. And so I'm just curious how so you gave examples about like climate literacy, and it would seem like that would be a case where many of us don't really need to know the science. We're not scientists, but we might be rationally ignorant about it as long as there are gatekeepers who do maybe provide that peer review or whatever it is that you think is the proper process. Is that a kind of fair summation of how you think?
No, I think that's right, and I would take it just one step further from the point of view of a psychologist and say it's not just that people, out of convenience, there's so many hours in a day, it's hard enough just to keep job, get the kids ready for school. So who has the time to do a deep dive into
Right.
And I think that's absolutely true. And of course, from that literature, we also know that voting does not really is not really a way of furthering your interest, because your vote is astronomically unlikely to decide an election.
It's a puzzle people vote at all.
As puzzle people vote at all. And the common answer is it's self-expression. So what I would just add as a psychologist is that it isn't just that people say, well, who has the time to find out? I'm going to let the expert decide and be happily ignorant. Rather, people do adopt beliefs. They just don't think that you only ought to believe things for which there are reasons. And if there are no reasons, you should be agnostic. That is very unpsychological or psychologically unreal. That is, people are perfectly happy to have beliefs in areas that they know nothing about, because especially if the beliefs are seen to have some kind of moral value, that is, they promote the right values, they make your side look good, and the other side look stupid or evil, or even if they're kind of fun to think, they're entertaining, they're worth spreading, people listen to you if you spread conspiracy theory, they're kind of fun. And the idea that I think a lot of people in journalism and academia have, that wait, no, you can't just believe something because it's fun to believe it, or because it makes your side feel good, or because it's a good story, or it's morally uplifting. You should only believe things that are true. That is a deeply weird belief. I think most of us, on good days, have that belief, but in it, we are being unlike the typical member of our species.
So I'm just going to ask a couple more and then we'll open it up. So just on social media, to go back to that, it seems like there's two things. So I think in your Enlightenment book, you talked about the printing press, and in some of your work, you talked about the printing press, and others have pointed out that one of the differences in terms of the spread of ideas with these prior technologies is there was always gatekeeping in various ways. Publishers made decisions, editors made decisions. Social media is by its nature unmediated, and so individuals can trade things true or false. So that's one big distinction. The other distinction is it's also been sort of weaponized in a way that we really haven't seen before, though that's not as new. We see versions of that in past technology. So I'm curious, when you think about the pernicious role of social media, how far do you go with that, and what do you think we should do? So for example, just to take a live issue, the proposed TikTok ban or TikTok divestiture, is that an appropriate response, or how would you, based on what you've learned, how would you approach that problem?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in the history of media, but my understanding is that although there was some gatekeeping by the scarcity of former media technologies, that is, you had to have a printing press to print stuff, but still, with every new medium, I think there was actually an awful lot of nonsense that was propagated. The printing press, of course, together with the Bible, which of course itself is filled with fake news and conspiracy theories. What are miracles with fake news? But also Malleus Maleficarum, the guide to witchcraft, which led to the massive witch hunt in the 16th century. When mass production of newspapers from the rotary press began and newsprint was cheap, I think my understanding is until respectable news outlets got their act together and formed associations and standards, most news was fake news. I mean, you open the paper and there were stories of sea monsters and alien visitors and babies born with two heads and miracles and all kinds of nonsense. Until I think it was maybe an expert in journalism, correct me, but I think it wasn't really until the 19-teens and 1920s that newspapers formed associations and set standards of editing and fact-checking, and where it started to matter whether a newspaper had a reputation for probity, accuracy, fact-checking, and so you, of course, didn't make them infallible, but it just meant that you wouldn't be reading about Martian civilizations and sea monsters.
I remember the Weekly World News, which had that sort of thing all the time, well into the 80s or 90s.
Well, exactly.
Right.
So the thing is that until, I think shortly after the turn of the 20th century, all newspapers were like the Weekly World News.
Okay, so I want to open up to questions.
I'll just mention one other example.
Oh, sorry.
I'll throw it out. book publishing. That in the early days, a lot of books were utterly plagiarized. The facts in them were fabricated. That you have no idea. Often, a famous author would be put on the title page of some nonsense that he never wrote. So it was kind of a wild west. So it may be a general law that any new medium will initially, until there's respected gatekeepers, will just result in a flood of nonsense.
Okay, so we like to start with some questions from students, just to kick it off. So students in the room, I'll start off in the back. Now we have, just to remind everyone, we have these box microphones. So just wait for this weird microphone to come to you. If you could just, yeah, perfect. Go ahead.
Whoa. Hello, Mr. Paper. Thanks so much for being here. I know we all really appreciate your lecture. And I learned about you in my high school psychology class and language learning, so it's quite exciting to see you here in person. My question was regarding like big groups of people maybe not finding the objective truth. Recently, like the stats class, we learned that if you have like 100 people guess the weight of a cow, the average of that guess is usually extremely close to the actual weight of the cow, even though the actual guesses themselves may be way off. So in that case, it seems like aggregating lots of different ideas might yield a right answer. So how do you kind of justify that with your earlier statement of maybe it might not be the truth every single time? Thanks so much.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Something's called the phenomenon of the wisdom of crowds, as you aggregate estimates. My understanding is that certain conditions have to be in place for crowds to be wise, as opposed to being carried away by groupthink or the madness of crowds. Among them are that the estimates have to be made independently. So in the weight of the cow example, everyone writes their guess on a slip of paper, and then someone on the stage quickly averages them. If you have a discussion going, then the most charismatic or influential or the guy with the lowest voice and the most effective mansplainer could sweep others to his estimate, no matter how bogus. And I think there's some other conditions as well. So it is a real phenomenon. And ideally, that's what you kind of statistical power that you want to tap in groups. But when they do communicate, I think you need additional kind of guardrails. That is, demands people defend their beliefs, openness to dissent and contrary beliefs, not privileging authority, but just privileging coherence and evidence-based and other kinds of guidelines.
Thank you so much.
We're going to go to another student question, but can I just follow up on that? We just had a pretty momentous verdict handed down today. Juries don't follow that independent standard. They deliberate. We're in the law school. So what's your view on whether that system is a good one? Should we in fact have independent assessments by juries that then are accumulated rather than having that deliberation that we associate?
Probably. In the sense, I'm not enough of an expert to give a definitive answer, but I do know there has been research on juries at least since the 70s, some of it involving the people in the jury pool who don't actually serve because there's enough demand.
Alternates.
All the alternates, yes. They'll have researchers will have a mock trial and experimentally vary what happens and then actually look at jury deliberations. My understanding is that a jury is not, especially with the unanimity, is actually not an optimal decision-making body. What you saw in, say, we also in 12 Angry Men, where one principal guy overturned the other 11. That apparently never happens. That there are coalitions, there's browbeating, there's influence, there's charisma, and so on. So it's really good not to be a defendant in a criminal trial, even for instance. And there probably are, I'm almost sure that there would be better designs. Certainly in the recent book by Daniel Kahneman and Cass Sunstein and Olivier Sibony called Noise, they note that there are systematic pathologies in certain kinds of committees and groups, particularly when they don't give independent assessments. They reckon that is, the noise gets consolidated or amplified in a way. The kind of wisdom of crowd situation is one in which the noise, the mechanism for the noise cancels rather than amplifies.
other students with questions? Yes. You have your hand, dark shirt, yes. Hand up, perfect. Put your hand up. What microphone is coming? I think the microphone can be tossed.
Oh, hello.
Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Professor Tinker. Thank you for your talk. I was learning my textbook, so it's an honor to speak to you. I was wondering, how would you think about the research regarding sort of like the spread of fake news or misinformation has to relate to the inattention to the truthfulness of the information?
Say it again?
Oh, yes. So the people's sort of like spread of misinformation on their social media has to do with their inattention to the truthfulness of the content itself, so they don't really filter through the message as much as they maybe, I don't know, norms as they should. And I was wondering, what's your thought on this, given that you were saying that institutions promoting sort of like the rationality, promoting institutions are important, but if people don't even pay attention to the truthful information, would they even, how is it going to mediate this effect?
Yeah, no, it's true that some, apparently, there's research by Gordon Pennycook and others, that some small nudges can tamp down the temptation to spread false news, which then, because of exponential growth, can go viral. And so even if you were to tamp down the slight tendency to repeat it, that could stop the virality of the theory. And even like notice, like, are you sure this is true, or do you have reason to believe this is true? When people are just reminded of that, they're less likely to pass on fake news. So that is a ray of hope, that there might be at least some nudges. But I think in the absence of something with a little bit more teeth, like a Wikipedia community, where there is some kind of informal policing, it's probably not enough, but it probably would help matters if the social media gave people these reminders. And I notice already that X has a policy where if you I guess you'll say retweet, re-X, repost something that you haven't clicked open to read, it will kind of nag you. Are you sure you want to retweet this? You haven't opened it to read it. I was sort of surprised to see that. It's probably not a bad thing. And again, I don't think it would be enough, but it wouldn't hurt.
I'm going to ask a follow-up from the other overflow room. There is an overflow room, and so it's sort of related. So the question is, why are young adults, I'm not going to endorse the premise, you can attack the premise if you want, why are young adults so trusting, underlined, of information they read on social media? Why do they have so much confidence in news from unreliable sources?
Yeah. So, the part that is unquestionably true is that younger people get more things from social media compared to certainly news printed on dead trees. Least of all, and that's really an old person's medium. Even cable news, I think the median, I read this morning, the median age of a CNN or MSNBC or Fox News victim is something like 70. So it's overwhelmingly, and for younger cohorts, it's overwhelmingly social media. The question is, what are they consuming on social media? That is, if it just links to articles in respectable sources, then that's okay. Is the second part of the premise that they buy it? People in the room, you should tell us, older people. The fact that that's where they get the news doesn't mean that necessarily that they accept everything that they read. But I mean, it is worrisome to the extent that, on average, certainly things in social media feed are going to be less vetted, less fact-checked than in specific sources that cultivate a reputation for accuracy.
I mean, isn't it even worse than that, though, in that so many of the algorithms amplify engagement, and engagement is often either hating on something or as you say, clicking or not clicking, forwarding and so forth, so that there's actually an inducement to have those things kind of shotgun all around.
Yeah, no, that is again, a real concern.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to the general audience. I'm going to give Chancellor Carnesdale first question.
We started with the 7 characteristics of rationality. Perhaps one of the maybe most troubling is I think statistics. More so than logic and even those of us trained in statistics, our intuition often fails us. like it when the weather person says, there's a 30% chance of rain.
They don't know what it
Am I
means.
supposed to bring a 30% umbrella? Is it gonna rain or not? They want it black and white. Now, here's the problem. As scientists, if we're really, we're always trying to say, based on our current understanding, as soon as you go there, your understanding might be wrong. So, creation, afterlife, you pick it. Anyway, can you prove that it's false? The answer is, you can't prove that it's impossible. So many of these things are not going to change because we never going to have perfect knowledge to prove that it's impossible. So why am I wrong?
So it's,
Could everyone hear that? I realize he didn't get blank.
yeah. I'm sure,
Try to paraphrase.
Okay, correct me if I so there is an intuitive resistance to statistical thinking. That people are liable to black and white fallacy, and that this is particularly pernicious in the case of accepting scientific conclusions, because necessarily scientific conclusions are stated in degrees of credence, and people mistakenly think that scientific facts are proven to be correct. They even say, where's your proof? And proof is actually something you get in math and logic, but not in science. So there are two leaps that people have to take. One of them is the statistical thinking in general. And I didn't have time, or it wasn't appropriate in today's lecture, to talk about some of the ways that people's statistical intuitions can be improved or honed, such as converting estimates of single events, like that woman has cancer. What is the probability that she has cancer? Which is actually a little bit of a strange concept anyway, single event probability. And people do have trouble wrapping their minds around either she does have cancer or she doesn't need to say there's a 0.3 chance that she has it. And so if you reframe these notorious Bayesian problems in frequencies, that is, instead of 1%, there's a 1% chance that a woman has breast cancer. You say, imagine 1,000 women, 10 of them have breast cancer. Of those 10, 9 of them will test positive. Of the 990 that don't, 89 of them will test positive. Then people start to avoid some of these errors in Bayesian reasoning, because they can kind of visualize quantities and subdivide them and not have to think in terms of the somewhat mystical concept of the probability in one case. Unfortunately, in the case of applying probabilistic thinking to science, kind of Bayesian leap, that is, in science, as you say, something is either, people can think, well, it either is the case or it isn't the case. What does it mean to say it's 0.7 likely to be true? It's going to be a heavier lift to get people to import what statistical intuitions we do have, which tends to be in relative frequencies, to the case of credence in a single proposition. So there has to be, I think, one possible route to expanding people's intuitions in the case of, say, the Bayesian approach to science would be to tap whatever intuitions allow people to gamble. Because when you understand odds, when you put money on something, you are betting on a single event, and you've got to have some degree of credence in which way it'll turn out. The election will go one way or another. Celtics will either win or won't win the NBA championship. To the extent that people can understand, as they must if they're going to put money on it, that's a kind of way of getting to the idea that scientific hypotheses, like sports outcomes, are single propositions to which you can attach a number between 0 and 1. And in fact, there is a part of the rationality community that advocates betting on outcomes, that prediction markets, even better than wisdom of crowds of simply aggregating opinions. Yet people bet on their opinions. Apparently that gives rise to even more accurate forecasts. If people could start to think of how much would you bet that so-and-so will win or lose, that might hone to conclusions.
Okay, a lot of hands, and we don't have a ton of time. So I'm going to take, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time.
No, the one
You don't want to do that? Okay. Okay, well, we can take like one at this
Tax
point.
everyone's memory.
Okay, go ahead now. Just wait for the microphone. We're just at the end of our time. Yes, please.
I'm looking at Daniel Pearl's photo above you and his words, "I am a Jew." And I want to ask you about anti-Semitism and the irrational beliefs on the right and the left and all over the world.
Yeah, so what's the deal with anti-Semitism? Yeah, it is, well, what is the corrective? Yeah.
I mean, that's what you're telling us about. You can only think this way then.
Yeah, it's, I mean, there's a number of, very deep aspects to that question. Why has anti-Semitism been so perennial over the course of literally millennia? And why has there seemed to have been an uptick in the last short period of time, maybe even a year, and what can be done about it? So in terms of, I don't have definitive answers to any of the three. It's sometimes thought, it's been proposed as as opposed to any kind of mystical thing like, all the world hates the Jews and they always will, and it's just one of the unfathomable mysteries of the human condition that's kind of unsatisfying. There is a theory from the economist and historian of ideas Thomas Sowell that anti-Semitism is part of a phenomenon of hatred of middlemen minorities, owing in part from economic illiteracy. That because Jews for many centuries have specialized in economic middleman niches, such as retailing and money lending, which even though economics tells us that any prosperous society has to rely on money moving around and on middlemen making things widely available across fungible markets, intuitively we tend to think of value as stuff coming into existence. So farmers create wealth, and craftsmen create wealth, and miners create wealth. We don't think of financiers as creating wealth or as merchants as creating wealth. There's a tendency to backslide and to think of them as parasites and exploiters and thieves. And so Jews get expelled, the economy tanks, but still people don't make the connection. And so there's constant hatred, which would explain why at least some of the phenomena of anti-Semitism can also be seen in hatred, sometimes genocidal hatred, of other middlemen minorities, such as the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, the Asians in particularly subcontinent Indians in Africa, the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam and Philippines and so on. That the common denominator is hatred of middlemen minorities. In the case of Judaism, there's the additional things, the myth of the deicide. Just living apart with insular customs tends to make any minority community a conspicuous target. So those are some of the answers. Why recently? Well, there's a sad tendency since any kind of ethnic hatred, but particular anti-Semitism, comes from a kind of bifurcation into tribes, us versus them. You do have, paradoxically, among highly educated university students, there has been the ideology that the world can be divided into oppressors and oppressed, kind of version of Marxism that left behind the whole bourgeoisie proletariat and grafted that onto races and sexes and ethnic groups. And so somehow, and economically, historically, bizarrely, Jews were on the side of the oppressors. And so an ideology that divides the world into good and evil in this rather toxic mindset, the Jews ended up on the wrong side. Aided by the fact that the situation in the Middle East involves some complexity, such as appreciating the point of even kind of moral philosophy 101 of what are the criteria for a just war, what is legitimate self-defense, when may force be applied, I think has receded in university educations in favor of oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. So that has partly explains why it's so prevalent on university campuses. Anyway, there are many more reasons, but I just want to have some ideas.
I know so many questions, but we're over time. Please join me in thanking